Hello, 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 and a very warm welcome to all our viewers, our friends that join us on this program. It is another episode of Africa Rise with Susan West, and I'm always counting down the days, the hours to the minutes, looking forward to seeing you again, beautiful people. Well, as usual, remember that as you join this broadcast, create watch parties, share this broadcast, invite your friends. And today, our guest is going to be Rutendo Benson Matinyarare. I hope I got his name right. He is a Zimbabwean who resides in South Africa, and the topic of discussion today is compensating white farmers in Zimbabwe. And so remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like and follow us on Facebook, and also, of course, on Instagram. Africa Rise is a program and it's a platform that is designed to promote everything that is African, to bring information about Africa and her diaspora. So please remember that the responsibility is all ours. Okay, do your bit. I have done mine. In a little bit, I will be bringing on the screen our guest for today. Okay, remember to send in your comments and questions as we go on as well. Right. Hello, Rutendo.
How are you today?
I'm
And
very
thank you for.
well, thank you. Your voice is breaking. Can you come again?
I was saying, thank you for inviting me on your show.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. The pleasure is all mine. So, before, without taking too much of your time, the conversation for today is something that is really I am passionate about because it's our responsibility. Every African is affected, whatever it is that goes on in any other part of Africa, regardless of which country, every African is affected one way or the other, regardless of whether we realize that or not. So, compensation of white farmers in Zimbabwe. I mean, $3.5 billion have been asked or have been asked to be paid to white farmers. And for ignorant people like myself, I would say that concerning the dynamics of Zimbabwean politics and all that goes on, we're wondering, where will Zimbabwe find that kind of money?
I'm not sure I got what you meant.
To pay white farmers $3.5 billion. So let's just take it from there, first of all. Why should Zimbabwe have to compensate white farmers that much when they have, when the country itself cannot afford it?
Thank you very much for the question. And the question is something that we have all been asking. Where will Zimbabwe get the money to compensate these white farmers? And more importantly, why should Zimbabweans compensate white farmers that were unjustly enriched by the act of colonialism that lasted 90 years in Zimbabwe and then went on even after colonialism as the status quo was maintained? White people continued to control land. They continued to enslave the Zimbabwean people until such a time that the Zimbabwean people began to complain and say that we went to fight for the liberation war so that we could get land, so that we could get back what it is that we got during colonialism. And that pressure, particularly from war veterans and a lot of villages in Zimbabwe, is what led to the land reform and the fast-track land reform in which people decided to take land. And that happened after the British government reneged on the agreement of the Lancaster House Conference that had agreed that the British government would pay for land, and basically the British government would be paying its own squaws, its own children, for the colonialism of Zimbabwe. But now that colonialism was over, they were going to have to pay the compensation to satisfy their children and to allow their children to continue to live in Zimbabwe or elsewhere without difficulties. So we don't know where Zimbabwe is going to get that money. They've spoken about creating a bond They've talked about going on a road show to try and find people to finance that amount of money, but that's basically borrowing money in order to pay a colonizer or to pay a colonial tax, which is absolutely unacceptable.
Wow. Why, in your opinion, why do you think the British, the English, will not stick to the initial plan of paying the compensation, like you said, to their own people?
The British will not stick to compensating their own people because they never intended for that land reform to ever happen. They initially thought that the Zimbabwean government or the liberation fighters who were negotiating that settlement were just negotiating for the sake of negotiating, and then eventually, when they got into power, they would forget about taking land. But what they
Right.
didn't understand is that the foundations of the liberation struggle were based on land more than anything else. It was then based on trying to get equality and voting rights. So Zimbabweans didn't go and fight a war for voting rights. They went to fight a war to get back their land. They went to fight a war to get back what it is that they lost during colonialism. And I think that the British did not have full appreciation of this. And that's why, even though they knighted Robert Mugabe to try and appease him, Robert Mugabe continued on the track of taking land because that is what the Zimbabwean people wanted. And that is the pressure he continued to get from the liberation fighters, or shall we call them the war veterans.
Right. Wow. So I have seen a video when this news first broke. I'm a Nigerian, so I started trying to understand the dynamics, and I looked forward to certain people like Dr. Ambassador Arikana Chayombori Kwayo, because I thought that, these are the people that will be able to give clarity on this issue. And when I heard what she had to say concerning letting bygones be bygones and just moving forward, and so I thought, okay, if she thinks of it that way, that must be fine. Then I stumbled upon your video, and you were against what Dr. Arikana's points on the stance on the issue was. So why would you differ from what she from what she's agreed, or what she agrees with on this particular occasion?
Well, I first of all disagree with Mama Chiwombori, because I call her Mama Chiwombori because she is my mother. I disagree with her because she was wrong. Her facts were wrong. First of all, she said that the Lancaster House Agreement was signed in the city of Lancaster. It wasn't signed in the city of Lancaster. It was signed in England. In London, sorry. The building, or what we call the Stafford House, is in London, and that's where the agreement was signed. She then went on to say that the agreement said that the British will pay for land, and the Zimbabweans don't have to pay for land, but they just have to pay for improvements. That's also incorrect, because the Lancaster House Agreement agreed that for the first 10 years of that agreement, the Zimbabwean government will have to pay for land and improvements. They'll have to buy back land from white farmers so that there is reconciliation in Zimbabwe. And then eventually, the Zimbabwean government created a constitution in which they talked about emancipating, or basically paying damages or paying compensation for developments on that stolen land. Now, Mama Chiwombori made it sound like the Lancaster House Agreement was an agreement that was made by equals. What she did not say is that the Lancaster House Agreement was made under duress. It was made by liberation fighters of Zimbabwe being forced to go and negotiate with the British government that had not allowed these fighters to get their victory from the Rhodesian government, who they were about to defeat. The British government forced these liberation fighters to go and negotiate, first of all in Switzerland and then eventually in London, under duress. They told the countries that were giving them their bases for their armed struggle, forced them to go for these negotiations, and they asked countries like Zambia, Mozambique, and Tanzania not to allow these fighters to come back and fight if indeed they did not get an agreement at Lancaster that suited them. So they actually told these leaders to tell them that if you come back without a settlement, you are not going to get bases to fight your war. So basically, these leaders of these countries that were giving us refuge basically said, you negotiate, you agree, because the war is over. So
Right.
that was duress. And that duress is what led to the Lancaster House Agreement. And we all know that in common law, any agreement that is reached under duress or by force shouldn't be binding, or at least it should be voidable. We come from there, we go on to how our Constitution was signed. Our Constitution was signed after a government that got into a Lancaster House Agreement was forced to buy land from white farmers, was forced to take Rhodesian debt, that is the debt of the colonizer, and then was forced to redevelop Zimbabwe without reparation. And that, in a culmination of 10 years, eventually led to the Zimbabwean government actually being very indebted to the multilateral lending institutions of this world in order to develop the country. That indebtedness, which was deliberate on the part of the British and the Americans and the Europeans that were on the opposite side of the negotiations with these liberation fighters, was deliberate to indebt this government so that when it gets to 10 years, when it can now change its constitution, when it can now determine how it is it's going to take land, it would be indebted to multilateral institutions who would then force a structural adjustment program on the very same people. And that structural adjustment program that started in 1990, when the negotiation of the new constitution began, allowed the Europeans, the ex-colonizers, to have influence in the constitution that was being written. You also have to understand that there were always going to be donors. They were our biggest trading partners. And that power and authority is what the Europeans, Americans, and the British used to influence the development of the constitution, and not only this constitution, but subsequent constitutions that came. So when the Zimbabwean government did say, we are going to take land because that's why we went to the liberation struggle, something that the British knew from the Lancaster House Conference, they then had to basically compromise again to compensate the developments on that land. But that compensation of development and the procurement of land, or this compulsory reform that would now need to take place from 1990, now had to have the compensation of white farmers, even though the British were supposed to put their percentage. But the way the percentage of the British was going to be put in is that there was always going to be a 50-50 split. Zimbabwe would pay for half, and the British government would then pay for half for the land.
Right.
And then the developments were seemed to have been inherited by the Zimbabwean people, so they would have to pay for the benefit that they were enjoying. But where we argue is that in common law, there's something called restitution. Restitution does not start with the compensation of the one who makes developments. It starts with the restoration of the one that lost property to their position that they would have been without the crime of colonialism. So this is what was supposed to have happened. Zimbabweans were supposed to be restored their land without any charge. After that land was restored to them, it was supposed to be brought back in the condition that it was before colonialism took place. The trees they should be there, the waterways that are there should be there, the animals that were on the land should be there. And then that person that was restoring, or the criminal that stole the land, was then supposed to return any unjust enrichment and pay damages for anything that failed to restore. That's supposed to be the starting point according to common law and according to international law that was set after the German occupation of Europe and its reparations to Jews and Europeans. That wasn't done. So if we had gone with the principle of restitution, the occasion of saying that there needs to be compensation for developments would never have come up, because developments were developed as part and parcel of the unjust enrichment that the farmers had earned from enslaving the people, from taking their cattle, from not giving them a room for competition, for being subsidized by our government, etc., etc., and etc. So that is the biggest problem. And Mama Chihombori should have known that. She should have understood international law. She should have understood that when she stands against the French being paid for developments or colonial tax, it's the same thing, because now Zimbabweans are having to pay colonial tax for developments that were made on farming land that was stolen by the British.
Wow. I was thinking, if we got to a place where we just say, let bygone be bygones, and let's if Zimbabwe, for instance, was able to raise $3.5 billion and paid off the compensation in the time frame that has been laid out, what does Zimbabwe stand to gain? Or what will then be a positive outcome if that happens for Zimbabwe?
Well, let me first of all say that there is no positive outcome in creating a legal precedent that goes against legal custom. So by Zimbabwe compensating white farmers, it creates a new form of legal custom for Black oppressed peoples to say that unlike the Jews, unlike the French, the Poles, and Europe, who had to be compensated by the Nazis for their occupation, Africans must compensate their oppressors. They must compensate those people that occupy their lands. What this does is create a two-tier system of human rights and a two-tier system of emancipation. One for Europeans, one for Africans. And the African one has got a lower standard that sees Africans having to pay their oppressors. So that really is a problem. And so there can never be an advantage that comes out of that. The Zimbabwean government has advanced the perspective, and Mama Chihombori also advanced the perspective that it is necessary for the Zimbabwean government to compensate white farmers in order for economic sanctions to be removed. This is not true. It is not true because the economic sanctions that are on Zimbabwe are two tiers. We've got ZDERA that has been instituted by the US Congress, and then we've got the executive order sanctions that have been instituted by the American president. So the two have terms and conditions for their cancellation. The ones that have been put up, called ZDERA by the Congress, say that, first of all, there needs to be a recognition of property rights in Zimbabwe. Now, when Europeans talk about property rights, they're talking about European property rights. European property rights that were acquired by the act of colonialism. So that means that they do not acknowledge African property rights, which should supersede colonial property rights, because colonial property rights are based on theft. So when the Americans say that they want a recognition of property rights, they're saying that Zimbabwe must revert back to the colonial status quo at independence, and they must look at property rights from that perspective. So that means Zimbabwe must ignore Zimbabwean property rights and African property rights. They then go talk about the compensation of white farmers. And from compensation of white farmers, they go on to talk about how Zimbabwe must revert to a tribunal ruling that was made by the SADC tribunal, which said that all taking of land from white farmers by the Zimbabwean government was illegal, and all land must be returned back to the white farmers as before the land reform program. So basically, the Americans are saying we should give back land, we should give back everything to white people, and once we've done that, we probably must pay damages to those white people because we are observing property rights according to white or Western decree, which looks at colonization as a legitimate control of African property in European hands. And then from there, it talks about human rights. Zimbabwe must observe human rights. Now, you need to understand how problematic this is. Zimbabwe observe human rights without any ruling being made by any international court or tribunal that proves that the Zimbabwean government violates human rights. And so therefore, because the United States was unilateral in prescribing these human rights to the Zimbabwean people, there is no standard that we're using to determine what human rights the Zimbabwean government must make up with. There have been a number of laws that the United States has asked to be removed in Zimbabwe, which is quite weird that a foreign country would tell another sovereign country to change its laws. Yet democracy says that laws should be made by representatives of the people that have been elected through a democratic process. And the UN Charter also says that the Zimbabwe nations are sovereign and equal. So you cannot have the United States imposing its extra-jurisdictional laws upon the Zimbabwean people. So for Zimbabwe to say we compensated white farmers, that means the sanctions are gone. It can't be, because they haven't met all the other 5, 6 conditions that were set for those sanctions by the US Congress and the US government. Then we go on to the executive order sanctions. The executive order sanctions were imposed by a declaration of a state of emergency or a national emergency by the United States government on the Zimbabwean government. And it said that the Zimbabwean government was an extraordinary and unusual threat on the United States economic interests, security interests, and then the foreign policy interests. Now, what that means is that Zimbabwe has got to stop being a threat to US economic interests, foreign policy interests, and security interests for those sanctions to go. But there is no document that specifies how it is that Zimbabwe is a threat to US interests. So what it leaves us is it leaves us with at the discretion to try and determine what those interests are. And United States economic interests are simple. United States companies must dominate resources of a nation and the markets of a nation and its labor. And that is American economic interest. What is their security interest? Their security interest means that whenever they need a base in Africa, whenever they need to secure strategic mineral resources that are required for their military industrial complex, they should be able to get them. And what is ironic is there's a document in the United States that was written that is called NSSM 39 that talks about how Southern Africa has the most strategic mineral resources that are required for the military industrial complex and industry in the West. So therefore, it becomes a strategic area of interest for the Americans where they need to secure these resources if their industry and their military industrial complex is to continue to survive. So these minerals can only be found in Southern Africa. These are platinum group metals, chrome, nickel, lithium, and I'm forgetting the other one, cobalt. These are found in Southern Africa. And this area has been targeted as an area of national security interest for the United States. So the assumption is they want to control those resources for their industry. So now the question that we've got to ask is, does compensating white farmers then automatically give the United States control over strategic mineral resources, control of our markets, control of our economy, control of our reserve bank, and control of everything that they want? And does it also mean that Zimbabwe now no longer gives priority to countries like China and Russia for those resources, for those economic to go away? Because that is what the United States is asking for. And by Zimbabwe paying compensation on the pretext that sanctions are going to go when they haven't met all these other conditions is problematic. It's also problematic because it makes us now assume that the Zimbabwean government intends to give in to these colonial requests and imperialist requests that are basically a form of neocolonialism, illegal at international law. So it worries us.
You know what? Listening to you as a woman and as an African woman, the emotions that run through my veins right now is that of a woman who's been kidnapped, who's been raped and raped and raped and raped over and again, brutalized, and then being told to apologize and seek forgiveness from her abductor. And I can't, it's so painful. It is painful that it looks like any which way you go, Africa stands to lose. In a scenario with a picture painted like this, how is Africa going to get herself out of this quagmire?
And do you understand that why I was so angry at Mama Arikana, who we actually had a lot of hope in, that she was one of those Africans that understood the African struggle and that she was going to stand with Africa, and then she takes a position that is totally juxtaposed and opposed to what it is that she's been standing for against the 14 French countries that remain under French colonialism. And the question they're all asking is, was she paid to take a PR position to say something that is contrary to the values that she's proclaimed herself to stand for, which is African emancipation? And my problem is, it's not like Africa does not have a choice. It's not like Africa does not have a way out. It is a problem of leaders that keep compromising, enslaving Africa for their own personal interests. And that's one of the things that I've got a problem with my president, is I believe my president wants to create a legacy. And in his mind, he believes he can create a legacy by giving into Western demands so that Western investment can come back into Zimbabwe, create jobs. If he can give his people jobs, then he has done a good job and emancipated his people. Unfortunately, Mr. President doesn't understand that European investment was colonialism. Today, the investment of Western companies in countries is the new form of colonialism. The colonialism is no longer political. It is now driven by economic interests and by capitalism that then, because of its economic power in a country, tells our government how to make their laws. We are living that in South Africa today. The South Africans want to break that. So how is it that my president can think that coming into the position of South Africa is the best way to emancipate Zimbabweans? Secondly, I feel that the Zimbabwean president is deliberately creating this precedent that is going to make it very difficult for South Africans to take back their land without having to fight over that land, or without having to take that land without compensation, and South Africa going under economic sanctions. And I believe that there might be this assertion that if economic sanctions happen on South Africa, South African investment will run into Zimbabwe, and that will grow Zimbabwe at the expense of South Africa. All unacceptable. We cannot continue as Africans to sabotage fellow African countries in order for our own development. And the South African government did this to the Zimbabweans, in that when economic sanctions hit Zimbabwe, investment started running from Zimbabwe. South African banks, which are white-owned and owned by a reserve bank that is owned by the West, allowed money to be laundered out of Zimbabwe into South Africa. And many leaders in Zimbabwe would love to return the favor to South Africa. But I'm saying African unity and African progress is going to require maturity. And it's going to require African leaders that do not believe in revenging and pitting themselves against each other for the benefit of the West, because at the end of the day, no one wins. And with creating a precedent that puts other African countries in a disadvantage, and a precedent that makes it difficult for Africans to be emancipated from crimes against humanity, creates an international precedent that means Black people can never receive reparations. Black people can never receive what it is that they lost during crimes, or crimes against humanity, like slavery. That's problematic. Now, imagine to yourself, the American Indians who are under Anglo-Saxon tyranny in the colony of the United States of America. And I need to stress this out. The United States of America is a colony, and it is a colony occupied by Anglo-Saxons, Germans, French, English, and that is not in doubt. And if the American Indian wanted their land back, they've got to pay compensation for each and every building, each and every road, every single thing that was constructed on their land without their authority, things that they probably didn't want on their land. They must compensate first before they can get their land back. That means it's impossible for them to get their land back. It's the same thing with the Aboriginal and the Maori in New Zealand, the Aboriginal in Australia. That is unacceptable. That is why the precedent set in Zimbabwe must be voided. And like I said, it was made under duress. It is voidable, irrespective of the fact that it was in the Constitution of Zimbabwe. That constitution was influenced by the UN, by the United States, by white South Africans who were involved with tampering with COPAC, plus the economic sanctions were always duress upon our government. That should be voidable because it's not an agreement made by the Zimbabwean people.
Wow. I'm just going to take a quick read of some of the things the viewers have commented or posted. James McConey says, Benson is right. How can you compensate for the land which was unlawfully taken from us? Yet the whites, they refuse to compensate for what they did to us. Absolutely. And let me recognize some of the people. I can see Toure is a Taure, Malvin Dube. I guess he's from South Africa. And David Barango, I see you. Thank you. Says a nice one. Selena Victor, hello. Rahina Bello, greetings. Diane Medway, thank you so much. I'm going to ask, what is the feeling of the people of Zimbabwe on this issue? When I'm talking about the people, I'm talking about the majority of the people in Zimbabwe.
I will be lying to you if I told you that I knew what the majority of Zimbabweans think. However, the few that we see on social media, and I'm saying this so that we don't mistake comments on social media for the broad consensus of what Zimbabweans feel. But the few Zimbabweans that I've encountered on social media are indifferent. A lot of them are indifferent because they've been brutalized by economic sanctions for the past 19 years. And while they were brutalized by these economic sanctions, nobody condemned these illegal sanctions. So many Zimbabweans feel their country is wrong and therefore they must just tolerate the punishment that they're going through. And the truth is that Zimbabwean people are being collectively punished. 17 million people are being collectively punished by illegal sanctions, which are a contravention of their human rights and a contravention of the UN Charter. And now, because Zimbabweans are in that position, many of them, there are some who feel that they're happy because maybe economic sanctions are going to go away. There's some who are happy who feel that because of this, the government is compromised with the West is going to normalize relationships with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe can begin to participate in the body of nations. All of them are wrong, fortunately. They are wrong because we saw Haiti compensating France in 1820, and Haiti is still suffering till today. And I want to tell the Zimbabwean people that they're going to continue to suffer. And with their government giving in to the demands of imperialism, they're only making a case for imperialists to continue to violate human rights of Africans because our leaders will give in. Then there are those who think that the government is wrong. I think you saw a comment from a fellow Zimbabwean there that believes that this is absolutely absurd. And there are some who actually supported sanctions who feel bitter about the fact that the Zimbabwean government is compensating the white farmers. But I've said to Zimbabweans, first of all, we have been warning Zimbabweans that this compensation was coming. And for 3 years, I, for one, was asking Zimbabweans to come together with us to write a petition to the British government. And I wrote a petition to the British government with another gentleman. Only 2 people wrote a petition to the British government to say, stop using duress and negotiating with our government behind closed doors about compensation, which we, the taxpayers of Zimbabweans, will have to pay for. Many Zimbabweans ignored that fight. Many Zimbabweans ignored us calling for their unity for us to have this fight. And eventually, we found this compensation. During that same period, we said, okay, you didn't join us to write the petition. Join us in fighting the sanctions. Because the sanctions are the illegal economic weapon, this weapon of mass economic destruction that is being used to push our government to undertake commitments to make rules and laws that are not beneficial for us, but beneficial for foreigners. The Zimbabwean people isolated people like me again, because they thought that by calling for the end to sanctions and calling for a fight against sanctions by civilians of Zimbabwe, we were trying to protect the government of Zimbabwe. Today, compensation is now on the table. The Zimbabwean government is using the sanctions as a reason why they've decided to compensate. The Zimbabwean people are bitter again. And I keep saying to the Zimbabwean people, you need to decide what it is that is your national interest. You need to decide what is the priority. You cannot support sanctions that are forcing your government to do things for foreign countries and at the same time cry about compensation. If you support the then support every action that your government will be forced to do. You cannot not want to write petitions with us, and you cannot not want to unite in writing those petitions, then complain about the Zimbabwean government being made to do what other countries whose citizens work for their countries are forcing our government to do. And that schizophrenia is what becomes annoying about Zimbabweans who complain about this situation when they've done nothing to stop it.
Right. I've got on YouTube, Ethnic News says the American Indians were given reparation in a form of casinos. There are more forms of reparations. They're issued to them. And I have Tamonodiepriye Micah from Facebook says, none of these Westerners came along with lands in their quest to colonization. That is really madness of the highest order for them to be compensated for that. Absolutely. So, I mean, it is clear to everyone that this is injustice, isn't it? But Africa has always been put. But Africa has always been put in a position of we lack power. We lack power. We lack what's the word now? For instance, the African Development Bank not too long ago, there was an issue. There was so much going on. And then in the process of trying to find out what the issues were and trying to do a little bit of my own findings, I found out that Africa Development Bank is not even owned by Africans. is not owned by Africa. How do we get ourselves, again, I ask, out of a quagmire like this if we lack leaders who have the zeal and the patriotism and the spirit of the Pan-African spirit that people like Robert Mugabe had? Of course, Robert Mugabe has his faults. He wasn't a perfect human being. There are loads of people who will say what they will, but at the end of the day, he was a Pan-Africanist, and there are people who believe that what he did was right, because when these people came in, they came without lands, and then they suddenly owned all the lands, and now the people who are original owners of the land have been given the land and now have to be compensated, now have to pay a compensation to the people who took it forcefully away from them, their ancestors. Again, I ask, how do we get ourselves out of this quagmire?
We get ourselves out of this quagmire. 2 seconds. I just need to find if my battery is charging, because I'm going to run out of batteries shortly. Give me 2 seconds. Let me see if my connection is fine.
Not a problem. So in the meantime, I'm just going to take just acknowledge.
Sorry, I'm back.
Ture, yeah, welcome back. There is Ron Beads. I'm going to be trying to pronounce these names, East African, South African names. I'm going to learn to pronounce them, but forgive me, Georgina Mungu. I'm going to skip pronouncing your first name because it's giving me a little bit of a problem. Anyway, please go ahead and respond to what the question is.
Right. My very first response is that we actually do have power, but we are not using our power. And the example of us not using our power starts with an example that I'm going to give with what it is that you did. You spoke about Robert Mugabe being a Pan-Africanist, but for some reason you felt the need to put a disclaimer that he's got his weaknesses, but that is where we start as Africans having a problem. We want to take narratives that we've been given by other people, and then we want to use those to judge ourselves. There was nothing wrong with Robert Mugabe. He's one of the greatest leaders that Africa has ever had, and we should start saying that unequivocally, in the same way that Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and all those leaders were the best leaders that probably exist in the world. Why am I saying? We've got genocidal maniacs like United States presidents who continue to kill women and children for oil. I've never heard the Americans saying any buts when talking about these people. Barack Obama is said to be one of the best leaders that America has ever had, but he's the one who killed Gaddafi, and he's the one who caused Arab Springs that happened on the African continent. Today, there's slavery in Libya because of what Barack Obama did, but Americans are not apologetic about saying that he is the best man and the best thing that ever happened to America, despite the number of people that he's murdered all across the world in crimes against humanity for the benefit of the Americans. Right now, the ICC is investigating the United States government for war crimes, and the United States government has imposed sanctions on the ICC. Whose war crimes are they looking at? Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Trump himself. These are the people that Americans never give disclaimers about. So why do we give disclaimers? Our leaders who have never been taken to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, because they do not have such human rights violations. So we need to start supporting our leaders without equivocation. Right now, we've got the situation in Zimbabwe. All our lawyers on the African continent should have come together to talk about and to write about what are the legal options that Zimbabwe has. Is this agreement even legal? Does it make sense to compensate white farmers or the sons of criminals that took our land in a crime against humanity? We should be having intellectuals writing pieces and petitions and coming together to organize themselves to go to international court to basically reverse this injustice. We don't have that on the African continent. So that is power that we are deliberately not using. If you understand the history of the African Development Bank, it was actually started by Nigeria and a few other countries. There were no Western countries. Then somewhere along the way, a rich country like Nigeria that has got oil that is given over to the Europeans, decided to invite the Americans and the French into the African Development Bank.
The biggest error The biggest mistake ever.
Why? Why would the continent that has actually created the wealth of the entire world need to invite anybody else into its banks? And a lot of people don't understand what we mean by this. And I always say to people, the richest country on the African continent, according to the resources that have been given to the world, is South Africa. It's on the African continent. It's followed by Congo. And then Nigeria, which has given the world so much oil that we probably even can't measure. Libya, area. All this wealth from the African continent is where the richest people in the world have their wealth. And the richest family in the world is the Rothschild family, followed by the banking families of America, a lot of which you can't even really measure their wealth. Their wealth was created in the mines of South Africa, in the oil fields of Nigeria, in the oil fields of Libya. The wealth came from this continent. The nuclear bombs that were used during the Second World War is uranium that came from Congo. So this is what we need to start understanding as Africans. And if we are making the rest of the world rich, why do we need to invite Europeans into our business? Why is our gold sold on the bullion market in London instead of being sold on a bullion market in Africa? London is not the biggest buyer of gold. London does not produce gold. The biggest buyer of gold is India. The second biggest buyer is China. So why is it that the bullion market still is consisting of European and American banks making a decision on the value of our gold? That doesn't make sense. Same as mineral exchanges. Why are our minerals traded in Singapore? Same question. So Africans have got to take back their power. And our power is taken back by understanding what belongs to us and stop begging for what is ours. Our land is ours. Our resources are ours. All the contracts and concessions that were given to Western countries must be cancelled because they are based on colonialism. We never got reparations for what it is that built these companies. Anglo-America is still doing business in Africa when it is the one that was responsible for apartheid in South Africa. Why should that be? These are the questions that Africans should ask, and that's how we take back our power. We take back our power by taking international laws that already exist, international laws made by the Europeans in the absence of Africans. We use those laws, human rights laws, international laws, and laws of our institutions and multilateral institutions. We must reinforce those laws because they do give us our humanity and our rights, if only we could enforce them. So the problem of Africans complaining about how it is that we are weak, we accept weakness. We are the ones who put ourselves in the position of weakness. And the problem is not just our leaders in politics. Problem is everybody, because leadership starts in the home. Leadership starts in the grassroots. I started a petition against the United States government, the British government, forcing our government to compensate white farmers. I'm not a leader. I'm not a politician, but I had to do something to stop the situation that was at hand. I'm not a leader, but an organization fighting economic sanctions in Zimbabwe. Hence, you now know me because I'm speaking about issues that represent our people. You probably would never get access to a minister in my country. You probably have never seen a single minister from my country speaking in the interest of the country. But you know me. That's me taking leadership from the grassroots level.
Absolutely.
And Africa was built with grassroots leadership. I come from Zimbabwe, where there was what was called the Mutapa Empire. It was one of the 6 empires, and I think you come from Nigeria, where there was Benin. That's an empire. There was also the empire in Ghana of Ashanti. These empires were built by people. And my empire is called Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone. What that means is that we built a country and a city made of a fortress of stone that consisted of houses of stone. That goes to show you that it is the grassroots leadership, the little stone houses that build a big stone house for that to be called a nation or an empire. And we need to go back to that, where every single African uses their talents, their knowledge to build a collective. And that knowledge and talents is not the Western education system, which actually taught us to just look and depend on our government. We are not people who are dependent on our government. We're dependent on our communities and family structures that produced to feed themselves. And from feeding themselves, they fed the whole community. From feeding the whole community, they fed the nation. And that's how nation stood.
Right. I'm going to take a short read again. There is Empress Ebiere Joseph Akonwa from Facebook. She says, we hear you, Rutendo. How the British or any of those countries with colonies in Africa still have a say in what happens in Africa is our own responsibility. Cowardice and weak leadership. Look at SADC nations. At what point do we, as African countries, start probing ourselves for bad leadership? Which is better, to tell the leaders of neighboring countries to sit up or to keep providing a coverage for them, for you, for well, for them, your neighbors to sit up, basically. And I'm going to take another read from YouTube. Ethnic News says we need to undo. We need to. Let me show that on the screen. We need to undo the Western program of indirect rule, which replaced colonization. We need to think steps ahead of the West if we are going to be free. And this is a compliment from Georgina, who says leadership indeed, and again, well researched. So, when we talk about African, I am one of the people who have been saying from time immemorial, I have refused. I remember the euphoria. I remember the way we felt when Barack Obama, the first Black president, was elected into office. And for us, it was a thing of pride all around the world, Black people all around the world. We thought it was going to give us some level of respect, finally.
Please unlock your device.
And as usual, they seem to find a way to use us against ourselves. I will tell you, I have been talking and talking. You can see what is going on today. You can see what is going on today in Nigeria. Nigeria is in a total mess as we speak. Just a couple of years ago, we looked like we were on the right track. And any sensible African anywhere would want to understand, why is it that there is not one single African country that can boast of some kind of meaningful development if they are not dancing to the tune of Europe and the Western world? To young people, if you want to motivate and inspire young generation, millennials, what would you say to them different that would make them think differently from what the generations who have given a total mess of the continent most of the time have the kind of mindset? Because young people lack leadership. Young people lack mentors on the continent. A lot of times, everyone seems to be confused and looking for someone to say something like, because we don't have we don't know a lot of times what our history is, what our background is. A lot of young people are lost. What would you say to a young person who wants some form of direction and clarity on how not to repeat the mistakes of their forefathers?
I'm one of those people that spends a lot of time writing history and writing events. And people think history is something that happened 100 years ago. The history is anything that happened from the hour that's just passed going backwards. And I always spend time trying to give history to particularly Zimbabweans so that they understand where we're coming from, so that they can understand where we are and what we need to change in order to go forward. So the youth tend to be lazy to read history. And unless and until our youth start reading history, they're never going to be able to find a way to fix Africa. And one of the elements that history teaches us is that consumption and the glorification of consumption is the biggest has been used against our people. The reason why leaders in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa continue to make decisions that compromise the people is they're so dedicated to consuming, they're so dedicated to boosting their egos of being called or wealthy or actually having more than the next man next to them. And this is what you see playing itself out in Africa. The Nigerian government would rather continue to have the oil of Nigeria being controlled by the West so that they can continue to then get shares within these Western companies, and they can continue to then bring in refined product from overseas and becoming billionaires that way. And when they become billionaires, they feel so special, and they use those billions to then go and buy mansions in Europe. In Zimbabwe, the same thing is happening. Our government, instead of trying to create laws that are and policies that are going to empower their people, they want to bring in Europeans so that they can get shares in these European companies and they can begin to live double lives, one in Africa, another in Europe. The South African continued to allow apartheid to continue. They did not break up the apartheid companies. They allowed the apartheid companies to continue to exist so that they can be board members and they can have shares in these companies and partake in the looting of South Africa at the expense of the people. It's happening all over Africa because African men and women have an ego of wanting to consume at their people's expense. That is get rid of. And unfortunately, the young Africans are the worst because they idolize the rappers in America who talk about Bentleys, who talk about Lexuses, who talk about Ferraris. And the moment you glorify that American culture of consumption, you're automatically pulled in to a system of individualism, a system of exploitation of your own in order to consume. So those are the things we break down. We need to remove Western TV from our screens. And the one thing that makes me get hope is that the Nigerians have been able to make Nigerians focus more on listening to Nigerian music much more than they focus on watching American music. However, the Nigerians must stop propagating the American message in their music. And if they stop that and begin to build cultural values that can build Nigeria in their music, they can change they can change the Nigerians. Zimbabweans the same, the whole of Africa the same thing. We must stop watching European TV, stop watching American TV, stop buying American culture. And in many steps, the Nigerians are actually far ahead of us. Your fashion, you wear your fashion with pride. That is a positive. You're listening to your music. That is a positive. If you can get rid of the consumption culture and start to build a community-based building culture, you're going far. South Africans are not far behind in the aspect that Black South Africans love their language. Unlike my Zimbabweans hate their language. The South Africans love their language. They also watch their own music, although the new youth are actually more Americanized now, which worries me. But if they can grow the issue of maintaining their languages, using their music and culture to now build positive messages that build a youth, then there is hope. We've got to get rid of this Western culture because that is where the problem is starting. And the Americans have created this culture, Hollywood, the music industry, specifically to ingrain our people or to indoctrinate our people's minds with the American self-centered culture of consumption, exploitation, and just not caring about the next man.
Overindulgence of Western, everything that is Western. That is, the young people need to begin to understand, to appreciate what they have, what is in their immediate environment, what is produced by them, and begin to think to become producers of what they want, as opposed to, even when you go to America, when you mention America, the music, the Black people, it is Black people who make this music. And they glorify all the things that are negative about that devalues Africans, especially African women. And this culture have been transferred into continental African culture, So these are the attitudes that needs to begin to change. And that brings me to asking you, sanctions. When a man is hungry, one of the tools that is used to force someone to comply is starvation. When sanctions have been laid on Zimbabwe for this long and there's so much suffering going on, the people naturally want sanctions to be lifted. Without sanctions being lifted, how can Zimbabwe get itself back to a place where it functions as a sovereign nation that can feed itself?
I'm going to say something that is going to surprise you, but Zimbabwe has actually survived sanctions for 19 years and it has been doing very well. The reason Zimbabwe has been doing very well for 19 years is that Zimbabwe educated its people, and so its people are an export. The biggest export of Zimbabwe right now is the Zimbabwean people. And the Zimbabwean people earn in excess of $30 billion every single year in the diaspora, and they bring a percentage of that back home. That has been able to keep Zimbabwe going. But the problem is the way the money has been utilized. It has not been invested in production, but it has been consumed. Zimbabweans back home don't even want to work anymore because they're so used to their relatives that are in the diaspora sending money. And when that money comes home, it is used for consumption, buying clothes, drinking, and not building Zimbabwe. So if us, people in the diaspora, the people who are suffering in foreign countries working to send money back home, can become disciplined in how we direct this money, we stop sending that money back home as in cash, and we start sending that money as seeds, machinery for agriculture, borehole equipment, solar panels, and even money to create biogas digesters in order to produce energy, we can begin to build a better Zimbabwe. And if we invested in actually putting the factors of production or the machinery that is required to get our farming production going, so biogas, like I said, solar panels, irrigation equipment, that equipment would need fitters. It would need people who maintain it when it's broken. It would need people who fix it when it's broken. That would create our industry for us. Because when you send an iPhone, sneakers, nice clothes, those things do not create jobs. They don't create industries. But when you put money into the solar panels, biogas production, energy production, irrigation equipment, and you produce farming produce or agricultural produce, that agricultural produce will need to be processed. It will need to be packaged. That again creates more industry. And that can keep our economy going and create the jobs that we're looking for. Once we create jobs and once we start empowering our people, that money that is made in Zimbabwe is reinvested. And then those people in the diaspora can use their skills, their abilities to market their products in the countries that they are, the food. And we've been saying to Zimbabweans, produce organic food. Stop using fertilizers. Substitute fertilizers which you import from America anyway. Stop using American seeds. Use local seeds that reproduce so that people can be able to produce enough food for themselves and then to export organic food that is very rare in the world. You can make a premium on that. You can export to friendly nations. We stop worrying about the nations that have got sanctions on us. I'm also saying we need to start sanction busting. Break the sanctions. Let's have SADC sit together and say there's certain products that are going to come from Zimbabwe and they will be exported through other SADC countries as products from those countries. This will help penetrate markets that have been closed for Zimbabwe. Payment system. When payment comes in, payments won't be blocked because the payment is coming to a fellow SADC member. This is what Rhodesia did when it was under sanctions. It came together with apartheid South Africa and Portuguese Mozambique to bust the sanctions that were imposed on it. We need to create our own banks and financial institutions. And this, what the president of Zimbabwe is doing, re-engaging white people so that they get ingrained in our economy again. And tomorrow when there's a difference with them, they sabotage it again. We must break that and become dependent on our own people for their own economy so that we stop being sabotaged by people that control our banking and they're aligned with the Europeans. And so when it comes to sabotaging us, it's easier for them. Then our nation, people like South Africa have also got to decolonize the economy. One of the biggest problems we've got in Southern Africa right now is South Africa is full of the apartheid governments, financial institutions, apartheid government companies that continue to sabotage the region, that you cannot do anything in secret. If Zimbabwe wanted to bring its products through South Africa, it goes through European companies and apartheid companies that then go and tell the Americans what is going on. How do you build a region, a country, black economy, when you've got the enemy between you? This is what is happening. So we've got to break that down. Then the biggest thing to breaking sanctions is the mindset. As long as Zimbabweans don't stand up for their own human rights, to say, I am being violated by United States human rights, and 17 million people stand up to cry for their human rights, the sanctions will be removed. Because as long as the sanctions look like they're on the Zimbabwean government and politicians, no one cares. The international community doesn't care. Africa doesn't care. But the fact is, those sanctions are on women, children, orphans. The sanctions are on very poor Zimbabweans. Those Zimbabweans have got to stand up and they've got to cry for their human rights and tell the world that they are being collectively punished because the United States wants to control the resources of Zimbabwe. The United States wants to enslave the Zimbabwean people on their own land using their own resources. And the United States wants Zimbabwe to be a captive market for their companies, organizations, and products. That's what Zimbabwean people have got to rise up and say. And until that happens, sanctions won't go anywhere. And until sanctions go somewhere, the Zimbabwean people always have a mentality that they need the West in order to survive. The Zimbabwean government, if it doesn't get to a point where it understands that it actually has a very powerful people. Zimbabweans have the fourth greatest amount of savings per capita outside Zimbabwe in the world. We have got more savings per capita than Saudi Arabia, than the United Arab Emirates, than the United States, than China. So that means that if the Zimbabwean people could actually recognize that potential and recognize that that money can be brought into Zimbabwe to lift Zimbabwe up, to invest in industry, to grow industry, we will not be in the situation that we are. So these are the things that have to take place. And I've written a strategy to the Zimbabwean government to this effect, to say you don't need the West to develop this country. You need your people. You need to have confidence in the 17 million Zimbabweans you have. And then you need to also pay attention to the 4 million people, 4 million Zimbabweans that are in the diaspora working as export labor, who can bring in repatriations, who are the biggest investors in the country. They are the biggest foreign direct investment in the country. Our government needs to have targeted policies to incentivize those people to invest in the country. The reason those people don't invest in the country is our government is ever talking about Western investment and foreign investment instead of talking about its people's investment. And as they focus on the West, which hates them, which is working to remove them, because ZANU-PF is always going to be needing to be punished by the West for defiling the West, our government is alienating itself from even friendly nations like Russia and China who can assist that government. Right now, we've got a war that's starting in Mozambique. Islamic militants have entered into Mozambique. The Zimbabwean military is at its weakest, and it does not get any military equipment from the West, but it is now beginning to damage its relationship with Russia and China, from where we could get military equipment, military training, military assistance to help us fight this war that's happening in Mozambique, which actually could be targeted at toppling the Zimbabwean government. I don't understand why our people believe in white people so much without believing in themselves and also believe in other non-white nations that could be better allies than the West. And for Zimbabwe, that was liberated by China, to have a mentality that they need the West just boggles my mind.
Wow. You know, having conversations like this is not a time waster. These are the little things, contributions we make that people hear and begin to have that mindset change slowly but surely. There are people who already are woken. People like us, people like you. There are many people who have come to that realization, but there are many more people who programs like this that is not streamed on, is not broadcast from mainstream media, which is 9 out of 10 times controlled by governments who are at the beck and call of Western powers, you know. So I'm going to take a quick read. We're out of time, but we can go a little more. Morenike Bolujoko, she's on watching from Facebook. She says, "Yet I agree. We need to stop begging and asking for and taking loans that don't make sense. I agree. Leadership starts in our homes. It starts within us by ourselves." Absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned Russia. You mentioned China. I am one of the people who have vilified China because when the COVID started, all the speculations, we were so confused. We blamed China. Then in retrospect, later on, we began to look at it and realize that we probably was too, we were too hasty in concluding that China was solely to blame for what we were going through. Now, just a few days ago, Russia had come out with a vaccine against COVID-19, which the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, also mentioned that his daughter has already been injected. The reason I'm raising this topic is because Africa, there is not one single country on the continent of Africa that produces a vaccine that we can put our faith in the hands of our fellow Africans and say that if truly this COVID we must have a vaccine to overcome this COVID, that we are producing what we know is for Africa, for Africans. We're at a precarious, we find ourselves in a precarious situation where even if the American president wakes up today and says, I have taken the vaccine and my family have taken it, we don't trust that the batch that is going to be sent to Africa is not the one that is going to bring us, sterilize us, is not the one that is going to bring some kind of disease that we're going to find out later on in life, or make our children come up with diseases or disabilities that we've never seen or heard before. Do you think, though, that at this point that African countries should be looking towards China if we have to have a vaccine?
I think I want to separate your question into two, because I want to put it, does Africa need to look at China, full stop? And then does Africa need to look at China for a solution to the vaccine? So the answer to the first question is that when you read the works of white supremacists, eugenicists, people that believed in white supremacy, the people Lothrop started, they were very clear that Africa must be separated from China. China must be separated from Japan and India and the rest of Asia, because they realized that China is a threat to the world if it can unite itself with Japan, India, Asia, and eventually Africa. Because what that does is it closes Western markets or Western products from the Asian market and African market, which constitute the biggest market of over 4.5 billion people. And so Lothrop started and other white supremacists were very clear that there has to be a separation of Africa, Asia, and China so that they never unite. Because if they unite, they become a threat to the West. Brzezinski also wrote a book that's called The Global Chessboard. I'm just forgetting the name, but he also wrote the same thing. So because of that, because China is a threat to the West, it is an enemy of our enemy. And because it is an enemy of our enemy, it is always strategic to partner with the enemy of your strongest enemy. And so it's always strategic for us to partner with China. And like I've already said, I'm a Zimbabwean, and we received our independence not from the Europeans, but from the Chinese, giving us training and weapons for us to be able to overcome Europeans. We also used Russia, because one of our other liberation movements got training from the Russians, while another one got training from the Chinese. That must never be forgotten. And we must also never forget that the Chinese were doing business with Africa well before the Europeans came to Africa. And the Europeans, through the Chinese, through the Silk Route, never colonized a single African country. They traded fairly, and there was a fair exchange of value. So whenever we start using the European blueprint to juxtapose that with what China stands for and becomes a threat to Africa, that's wrong. Because China has never posed a threat ever since it came to Africa in 1714 with Zhang He. And I always think that that is a sea voyage. But before the sea voyage, there was a lot of trade through the Silk Route. So Africans must look at China as an ally and create negotiations and deals with China on a fair and parity basis. But we must never begin to look at China like Europe before China behaves like Europe or acts like Europe. Now, on the issue of vaccines, I'm not convinced that human beings need to be injected with small doses of a disease in order for them to be able to fight the disease. I say because the designer of this world, the designer of this life, the designer of this universe is perfect. He's the most perfect designer ever. And he did not create human beings to just die from diseases. Hence, we are injecting them with doses of the disease so that they can build their immunity. That means it is our bodies that do the healing. It is our bodies that use their own immunity to fight these diseases. And the process of injecting somebody with a vaccine is to basically inject them with the disease to build their immunity. That tells me that the body is capable of doing this without being injected. What we need to ask ourselves is what compromised our human immunity in the first place? Why do human beings now need a vaccine? Why aren't they just able to contract the disease and then build their immunity naturally rather than doing it through a vaccine? It is because our immunity has been compromised by the food that we're eating. And when we all were born, we were injected and inoculated with vaccines. Why did we accept that? That's where our problem starts. And we can't continue to repeat the same mistake of injecting ourselves with these things. How do I know what I'm saying is correct? When the Europeans came to Africa after the doctrine of discovery, they were running away from Europe because they were dying of diseases. They were dying of diseases, they were dying of starvation, they were dying of pollution that they created for themselves through the industry they created, through the technology that they were using in Europe, through their greed that made them eat all the animals in Europe, including hyenas and lions. And so when they came to Africa, they came and found a very healthy people. That is why Africans were the only people capable of being slaves, because they were the strongest and most healthiest. So whatever the European wanted to or brought to Africa is the source of our immunity deficiency. The technology, their way of life, their medications, all that is the problem. So Africa doesn't need to keep relying on China and Europe for its remedies. We had the remedies that made us the strongest people in the world. We had the remedies that made us slave quality. It takes the most strongest human being to be a slave. So we have the solution in Africa. We must go back to eating the food we were eating, go back to the food we used, and we have to start shunning some of these technologies that we're addicted to, because they are the ones that attenuate the immunity of human beings. We've got to eliminate some of these foods that were brought from Europe into Africa and start to eat African food. We need our pounded yam to be pounded yam, mustn't be tampered with by the Europeans. We don't need GMOs. We don't need hybrids. We don't need all these destructive elements that weakened them and kept us as the strongest people in the world. And remember, we're the oldest civilization. We're older than all of them. How come we are older than all of them if our ways were not the correct ways? How come the world is about to get to extinction just because of 700 years of European enlightenment? It means that the ways are destructive. We must go back to our ways. So our vaccine is not going to come from anywhere else in the world. And we don't need a vaccine. We need to continue to keep a boosted immunity. And remember, African medicine never just dealt with the physical part of humanity. The African way of medication was holistic. It looked at your spirituality, it looked at your mind, and it looked at your food. That was what gave you health. We avoided being sick. We avoided being diseased to cause disease, much more than we relied on putting chemicals into the body to poison the body, create more problems, and then look for more chemicals to take care of the problem that we've created with the chemicals. I think you get where I'm going with this. So we need to stop relying on other people for our solutions. Our food is our doctor, our herbs, our trees. And that's why you see European culture always say it's an evil culture, it's an anti-life culture. It always comes with removing trees. It always comes with destroying nature. It always comes with changing what is already provided by nature. Our solution is nature.
Absolutely. Our solution is nature. You have fed us with so much knowledge today. Unfortunately, we're so out of time. But I must ask you, though, that in the nearest future, you will come back again, because there is so much more I want to ask you. And I'm sure the listeners or viewers will agree with me. Thank you so much, Benson Rutendo Matinyarare. Did I get your name right?
Yes, you did. If only you can throw away the Benson, I'm happy.
Okay, we throw that away. Okay, then. Rutendo, thank you so much for coming. And I will reach out to you again in the nearest future. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Good night.
Good night. All right, there you have it. Thank you so much. Let our food be our medicine. Let our food be our medicine. We don't want medicine to become our food as Africans. And of course, on the premise of compensation of white farmers in Zimbabwe, you heard all that Rutendo had to say. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us from YouTube and Facebook. I do appreciate. Please remember to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Follow and like our page on Facebook. This is Africa Rise with Susan West. I will, of course, in our usual manner, announce who the next guest is going to be as we go into the week. Thank you so much, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.